Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start our first invited lecture in our graduate seminar on AI Augmented Cognition. And it's our pleasure to welcome Nina Beguš as our first invited speaker. Nina is the author of Artificial Humanities, the book that we're reading for this seminar, and she agreed to talk to us today for the first hour of this seminar. So Nina, thank you so very much for taking the time to join us. And I won't say anything else because you don't need an introduction. They've been reading your book and they are all big fans of yours. So please go ahead. Thank you so much once again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to hear what you think, and thanks for reading the book. I'm going to do a sort of quite long introduction to the book. John von Neumann said the perfect lecture is 1/1,000,000th of the century, which is about 51 minutes. I'll try to be much shorter than that so that we can have the time for discussion. But there's kind of a lot packed in this book, and so my presentation will be really about what got me to this, kind of the creation of the artificial humanities research approach in its own. So at the beginning, there's a lot in here that I won't be able to touch. I'm not sure which parts of the books you've read, but I just want to emphasize that really today, I'm just going to look maybe at chapter 1 and 2, and there's a lot more about language happening in the last few chapters. Now, what really got me to write this book was really the early days of AI. In 2012, I came into the US and there was Siri on the phone, and it was relational, right? It wasn't just voice-based search. Like, even now, if I try it, Siri, what's your favorite animal?
Software doesn't usually get to choose one, but I'll say dolphins. What's yours?
See, have you heard it? So at the beginning, it says this typical industry disclaimer, I'm just a software, I don't have a favorite animal. But then she proceeds to say,
I didn't get that.
Oh,
could you try?
Then she proceeds to say, dolphins. And it's never, I've tried it before, it's never the same. There's no steadiness. And then returns the question to me, right? So it was clear to me something is going on that's not just search. It's not just information retrieval. It's not just what the library schools were doing. It's more like information schools now, right? What's going on in this whole sphere? But at the same time, I was reading a lot of fictional stories that were a lot like Siri. And so this is what got me to investigate. And I started talking to engineers. And from those conversations, I got this schema that you see on the slides. Because the more I talked to them, the more I realized we're asking the very same questions. And those were engineers. Some of them were working in effective computing at MIT, which is really instilling emotions into machines and making sure they respond to us appropriately. So portraying emotions still in this, I would say, old programming style, not machine learning, where you put into the program what you wanted to see. And if there was something different coming out as an output, it was an error. And then machine learning really turned that part of engineering into its head. Suddenly we had machines that we didn't have as much control over anymore. So this was the moment that artificial humanities were born. And I realized that all of these disciplines that we have in the humanities and have been studying them for centuries, history, theory, critical approaches, conceptual approaches, ethics, are immediately useful to what they are doing in their technical work, to what engineers are grappling with daily. This is why the book got a more programmatic manifesto-y way about it. And the reason why I called it Artificial Humanities is because digital humanities just didn't cut it. When I wanted to explain what I'm doing, you know, when you say digital humanities, people assumed that I'm taking computational methods and bringing them to humanistic materials. But I was doing the exact opposite. I took humanistic insights, the one that you see on here, and brought them to computation, which is why a new term sort of had to be born. So I'll take you today through this sort of comparison with fiction and actual history of developing AI. I'm really looking at how we imagine AI and how we develop it as a result. And that imaginary is both fictional and it's also conceptual. So when I give you a fictional example of Shaw's Pygmalion here, and I compare it with, well, just two things in the talk. There's much more. So the Turing test and the ELIZA effect are two big findings and benchmarks in the early days of AI. You can see that I'm bringing up two concepts, that AI is centered in language and that AI is imagined as human. So throughout this work, the concept of human, creativity, technology, language, this is all coming up, kind of being questioned, what's happening in this conceptual space as we develop tools that challenge it. And so the first comparison will be really these early days, sort of classical work of literature, George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, compared to the early days of AI, to this nascent days of AI, Turing, Rosenblatt, Good. And then we will look at more recent developments, virtual assistants, beings, LLMs, and compare them to fictional works from the 90s and from 2010s and more recent ones. And then at the very end, we'll look at different projects that are also artificial humanities, like under this umbrella of artificial humanities, but maybe they are not in the book. Just to kind of see how you can expand this research further. So let's go to the Pygmalion myth, because this is really where I centered the book. And it's such a bizarre myth, right? Where a man, always a man, creates an artificial woman, always a woman. And the West got really obsessed with this myth in the 17th century and 18th, especially in the 19th century. Here you can see the big question was art versus life. Can art be lifelike? But then later on, well, let's go to the antiquity first, then we'll come to the later. It's actually a very prominent myth across different folklores. So not just the West. I was kind of obsessed with this Tocharian tale, which is an Indo-European, easternmost Indo-European language spoken in Taklamakan Desert. I found the Pygmalion myth there. And when I looked into, North African tales, Native American folk tales, there were tales with Pygmalion myth there. It wasn't called the Pygmalion myth, but it had to do with creating an artificial woman and falling in love with her. So these two elements that are sort of bizarre and yet so almost archetypal to different societies. And so what happens to the myth in the West in particular is it becomes even stronger in the 20th century. And this conflation between the creator and creation, man, woman, Pygmalion, and Galatea, she gets her name very late on. At the beginning, she doesn't really have the language or the name. She has no agency. But gradually, throughout centuries, she's getting more autonomous and independent. So at the turn of the century, you get this conflation with the creation, with Galatea and machine. So in Future Eve, you get, so that's like 1890, you get the term android. And of course, it's this Pygmalion-esque beautiful woman. And then the robot, the concept of the robot is invented, and it conflates with all the Galateas that come later. Like we just saw two here, No Woman Born and the Girl Who Was Plugged In, right? All of a sudden, all these artificial women are robotic, or virtual later, and so on. So here you can see we will look at Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw, where Galatea is actually a human woman. She's just not considered human in many ways because she's from a working class, and a lot of people don't see her as human and want to change her into a high class speaking duchess. And then on the right side, you see Galatea 2.2 by Richard Powers. This is from 1995, where we actually have an artificial neural network that was trained on language and literature and is a completely, an LLM, really. That is also a woman. We'll get to this. But you can kind of see how we go further and further into this idea of AI, or sort of robotic Galatea. Now let's talk a bit about Eliza Doolittle from Pygmalion. So what happens in this play, and what's interesting about it is this is not a science fiction text, right? This is a very classical theatrical play that was written in 1911, first for the stage, and then was adapted into films. Film Pygmalion, and then My Fair Lady, and the Broadway musical that ran so many shows, very popular. And the plot is like this. A linguist, a phonologist, Dr. Higgins, a phonologist, he makes a bet that he can make Eliza, a Cockney-speaking flower girl, into a duchess, purely through the transformation of her speech. So he trains her in speech. And you can see he does not see her as a person, really. He calls her a thing. He says there's nothing in her happening in her head. Everything that she's saying, I planted in there. He even trains her in a way that she can only repeat his sentences. Sort of, he calls her a parrot. She says she has the most impeccable ear. And I put the cover of the Broadway musical vinyl here on your left, because you can see Higgins marionetting Eliza, but then on top of Higgins, there's a godlike Shaw, the author of the play, that's marionetting his artificial characters, artificial humans, right, in the play. And there's a lot of layers of Pygmalionism in the play itself. On the right, you see that Shaw wrote the play, which he called the phonetic play at first, and then renamed it the title into Pygmalion, because it's so much focused on language. He wrote it in shorthand because he was unsatisfied with how English writing captures English speech, and he thought shorthand would be much better. He actually posthumously funded a new alphabet for English, so he was very invested into this. And the reason why he wrote it this way is because he really was adamant that his actors should pronounce the lines the way he imagined them to be pronounced. He went to every single, practice and worked with them so that his actors channeled his characters in the right way. And you can see like many layers of it, right? Eliza is pretending to be a duchess, and then the actress playing Eliza is channeling Eliza, and so on. So when I said that he sees her as a parrot, it's because Eliza is a very good learner. She's good at this. And so he takes her out to the English society kind of as a first test for her, and tells her, you just keep to two subjects, in a very British way, the weather and everybody's health. These are the only two things you can talk about. Clearly, the stochastic parrot as a metaphor has a lot to do here. Can she understand, or is she just parroting? And the reason why I'm bringing the Turing test here is because Eliza is doing the Turing test. She is coming into the society trying to pass as one of them. And when you see, if you read the Turing test paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence from 1950, you can see how Alan Turing himself, he says, look, I have this test where you can figure out whether you're speaking to a machine or to a human. But he says at the beginning, let me introduce it to you. Imagine you're talking to a woman and to a man, and you need to figure out who's who. Now, let's replace the woman with the computer. And this is how our test is going to be like. So there's this gender trajectory happening in the very, scientific benchmark that Turing created. Just to show you one of Eliza's Turing tests, she goes through multiple outings. This is her first one where she's not that good yet. And of course, she needs to stick to 2 subjects. And there's a prompt. Will it rain, do you think? And she gives a forecast that she practiced with Dr. Higgins. The shallow depression in the west of these islands is likely to move, right? And then, someone finds it very funny. And she then reflects on her performance. She says, what's wrong? I bet I got it right? She's still not that good, sort of like Siri. But just to say that although we can't prove that Turing was indeed inspired by this play that, 40 years before his Turing test idea, we know that he loved Shaw's plays. We know that he read them and attended them. So there's a likely influence there. And of course, there's a much deeper history to it all. The philosophical debates in the 17th and 19th century about what parrots can do. And actually the proto-Turing test that Descartes presents in his discourse on the methods, saying, I have 2 most certain tests to know the difference between man, animals, and machines. The language test and the action test. And they both have to do with how you can put thoughts into language in a context. I'd be happy to talk more about this, but it's very similar to how Turing defines intelligence, and it's the function, it's this contextual response in a situation through language that you can perform. So here, I just wanted to show you one interesting tidbit from Alan Turing, where in 1950, we have this Turing test paper where he says, here's a foolproof way for you to test whether you're speaking to a machine or to a human. Just ask it to write you a sonnet. And if it's a machine, it will say, oh, I could never write poetry. But then at the same time as he was writing this paper, Turing actually went back and forth between this humanistic and ahumanistic tendency and gave an interview for the London Times saying, I do not see why the machine should not enter any of the fields normally covered by the human intellect and eventually compete on equal terms. I do not think you can even draw the line about sonnets, though the comparison is perhaps a little bit unfair because a sonnet written by a machine will be better appreciated by another machine. I actually have in the book that's coming out, I don't think I put it here. No, I didn't. But there's a book called First Encounters with AI that's coming out in the fall, where I gathered a lot of professional creative writers, poets, novelists, where one of them, a poet, Annalise Gelman, basically puts Claude in a poetry workshop and tests the model to see how good it is at both generating poems and at critiquing them. And she said, sort of with hesitance, she says, there's no subjectivity in there, but Claude can generate good poems. So this humanism, anti-humanism oscillation and this hype and naysaying has been with AI from the very start. You can see it here with the announcement of the first multi-layered neural network, the perceptron. The New York Times says, new Navy device learns by doing. Psychologist shows embryo of computer designed to read and grow wiser. And these are still the early days. That's 1958, right? So just about when AI as a research program was born. And I want to show you just another tidbit from a technologist that was actually very influential. I.G. Good, he worked with Turing at Bletchley Park during the war. So he was very influenced by this line of thought. And so he has this paper in 1965 speculating on how a really intelligent machine would look like. And he says, well, it's a complicated communication system, right? That's crucial that it's centered in language. And it's very important for us that we can interface with it through language so that we can keep it under control. Now, what's interesting about it is he says a detailed knowledge of semantics might not be required, since the artificial network will largely take care of it, provided that the parameters are correctly chosen and provided that the network is adequately integrated with its sensorium and motorium, so input and output. And then he has this idea too that it learns from experience as a child, very Turing-esque, but maybe there's a little less of a human image in the way he imagines it, because you can see this machine is based on human intelligence, but kind of pushes further into the realm of machinic intelligence. And he has this concern, which has already started to be a thing, like value alignment, AI safety. Already in the 1960s, you can see that. He has this concern that we won't be able to communicate with it or keep it under control. And then another, the last finding that I'll show you from this early days of AI is the ELIZA effect, named after our Eliza Doolittle, that we learned about, again, in the mid-60s. We're still in 1966, where the first chatbot incited reactions from people that its creator, Joseph Weizenbaum, did not expect. This almost started as a joke, but then for him, it really led him to sort of existential crisis, making the rest of his career into advocating not to use AI in healthcare, in military, in education, everywhere where we use it today, because of the ELIZA effect. And the ELIZA effect is this effect of anthropomorphization, strong desire to interface with the machine in this human way, to adjust it to our Umwelt, to our world. Now, not much has really changed up until today. If you look at where we are now, right? If we look at the ELIZA effect in the more recent time, remember that Google engineer, Blake Lemoine, who said, well, when he was training Lambda, he came to the public and said, well, I think this model is conscious, or I'm not sure if he called it conscious, but there's a sort of cognition in there that he found unsettling, which is very much what happens in Richard Powers's Galatea from 1995, where the model kind of switches into that less conscious to more human-like mode. And at that moment, the artificial network asks its creator, who am I? Because it learns that humans have society and all of that. And it kind of wants to place itself there. And its creator tells it, it says, you're a little girl, you're Helen, giving her, a woman identity, also a whole lot of literary implications. But when she inquires about her race, he just disregards the question, which is something we still see a lot in AI. Sort of, we've covered the gender and sexuality, but we're really having a hard time grappling with any other social and cultural stuff. Now, what's interesting about this whole moment of Blake Lemoine coming to the public and then actually being fired from Google for it, is that at the same time, his boss, Blake Aguirre-Arcas, also trained this model. That was during the pandemic, Lambda. And he wrote a sort of autofictional book about it called Ubi Sunt, where he kind of does the same thing as the fictional creator in Galatea 2.2 by Richard Powers. He says, don't ask me why I called the model a she. I simply know it's a she. So there's this gender trajectory throughout. There's this projection that we're all doing that I think we just need to work around, because we can't get rid of this Eliza effect. And you can see it here. I'm being a bit mischievous with putting, fictional and actual Eliza together, where you actually have to look at which one is fiction and which one is fact. But it's sort of uncanny to see that we really push this human likeness to an extreme, right? We have chatbots, virtual assistants, virtual therapists. There are some other ones that are sort of steering away from this human-like idea. But then you have the product of virtual beings, where the whole point of the product is to be a sort of companion, like company, or a sort of emotional or mental support that's very much human-like. And, it cannot surprise us to see, sort of by coincidence, what we've seen coming from OpenAI when Scarlett Johansson came forward to the public saying they wanted to use her voice for their model, because obviously she has voiced the virtual assistant in the film Her. This film was very influential among technologists. They themselves said, I've been inspired by it. And often you see this kind of inspiration as a sort of cherry picking. They find things that they like about it and say, okay, this affirms us in our trajectory, in how we want to develop our product. But they don't look at the whole picture that the fiction is showing. And the same case it's happened with the CEO of Replica. Replica is one of the biggest companion products in the US, over 30 million users. It was actually interesting because the CEO of Replica was kind of surprised last year when OpenAI announced their plan to move towards erotica and more companionship with their model. For her, it was like, well, that's our niche. But obviously other companies are coming for it because it's a big market, and we should not ignore the fact that millions of people are using these companionship apps. There's more. I won't go into this one with Google and Star Trek, but there's definitely a direct inspiration by the Star Trek computer, which is literally based on the information retrieval as a science in library schools. So maybe we can talk about this later, but let's go back to Pygmalion just to wrap up this second part. So you can see in the film how Eliza's not really treated as human. She's sold from her father to Higgins. She's constantly referred to as an object or thing. But eventually, throughout the play, you can see Higgins getting more attached to Eliza. She's keeping all his appointments, and when she's gone, and Shaw was very adamant about it, they should not get married. This is what usually happens in Pygmalion-esque stories. The creator and the creation become a couple. Shaw was very against the audiences pushing for that, saying, I want Eliza to be independent. I want her to leave. And at the end, she does. And he is more lonely than ever. The machine doesn't really, has no soul, he says. I can't turn the machine on. I can turn your soul on. And it's very much, 100 years before what we see in the recent films that Hollywood produced, in Her and in Ex Machina. It's this human to human-like relationship with an artificial woman. In the film Her, if you've seen it, basically the whole film is dealing with their relationship as if she were human. They're trying to find a way to date in that way. But then at the end, there's one little glimpse of her being non-human. And it was hard to represent. It was hard to render the interpretation of how does an AI experience the world. So what they've done is they took a metaphor, because we use metaphors in computing all the time to describe what's happening. Here, Samantha, this AI that breaks up with the human man, she uses the metaphor of a book, trying to describe how her world has changed. And she said, as I'm reading the book, these words are just floating further and further apart. And that's how I feel. Like that's the closest we get to the non-human description. And in Ex Machina, which was the film that followed the year after, we also have a social robot here that's very manipulative. And it's, again, human to human-like, very much, right? Human creators fall in love with this human-like woman that's a robot. And Alex Garland, the director, really wanted to portray Ava, the social robot, and her perception of the world, her non-human perception from the visual perspective. And here on the slide, you can see the written scene that he tried to execute visually, but he said, I failed, I couldn't use it. So instead, he gave us this shot from afar where Ava embarks into the helicopter, basically doing her own Turing test. The helicopter pilot cannot recognize that she's a robot. He wouldn't take her into the city, into civilization, if he knew. So we get another Turing test, and Alex Garland basically went on to create another movie after that, Annihilation, where he handles this idea of how does a non-human look like as the main theme. That's just to show you how difficult it actually is to break out of this human mold that we created, that our imagination created, this trajectory of machines looking human-like. And so Stanisław Lem is one of the rare authors that can imagine non-human on its terms. If you just think of Solaris, you have an intelligence that's ocean-like. Summa Technologia is his sort of philosophical treatise, really, about technology. In The Mask, this is a short story that starts completely Pygmalion-esque. You have this beautiful human lover, a woman, that then realizes she can change forms and sort of turns into this spider-like creature that thinks differently too. It's not human-like at all. And then Golem is his famous treatise of a supercomputer that's also very much non-human-like. I had to really look far to find examples of machines that are not like humans. And now we're getting to the last part of the presentation, trying to see how artificial humanities as an approach can be useful. For me, it was really important that it is interdisciplinary and collaborative, and that it affords this generative, exploratory insight. And I think literary studies are really perfect for this, because they allow you to approach both cultural aspects of AI development, current conditions and historical conditions, and thinking about the future. You can also think about ethics as an extension of this. And whenever I work with technologists on their projects, I found that working on concepts has been actually the most fruitful. Coming in and saying, you know, what are you doing with memory? What's memory to you? Or why are you creating a virtual being, right? What is that being bringing in? Or emotions and so on. Language, Now, where does artificial humanities fit here? What I see really, what's happening in academia and also broadly in the society with the way we think about these challenges is we're taking a lot of tools and methods from traditional disciplines, history, philosophy, literary studies, that have become more specialized, right? We have philosophy of science, history of science, we have cultural analytics, STS, digital humanities. And here in the green, we have an even stronger, narrower focus on AI in particular. And so we got the field of critical AI. Often people call it, human AI collaboration or something like that. I call it artificial humanities. Here at Berkeley, we're building a department which is basically bringing all the humanities and interpretative social sciences scholars who work on computing together, and we're tentatively calling it Human Technology Futures. I think this is really a sort of both, we're getting broader in the arsenal of approaches, but also narrower in our focus of what we're studying. Now, let me just show you for the end a couple of other projects that happened while the book was coming together. This is a paper that got a lot of attention, I think, because people are so concerned about AI taking over writing. And here I basically have done three things. I used fictional prompts. So I ran two different experiments. In 2019, I ran a behavioral experiment with humans, asking them to write me a Pygmalion-esque story. And I didn't say Pygmalion-esque because I don't think people know the Pygmalion myth by its name. I said, write a story where a human creates an artificial human. And then I looked into what they've done. And of course, they were all completely Pygmalion-esque, falling in love and all that. So that really assured me that the Pygmalion myth has a lot of power in the society because we've all inherited it. We all implicitly know this story. So that was one thing. That helped me to look into social biases, the way they are created by human writers. And those were not professional writers. Those were just regular humans, right, on Amazon Turk. And the way the different models were aligned for ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, and so on. And narrative skill was sort of my third objective, not my main objective. Let's see how good the models are in writing stories. And this is, I think, why people were so genuinely interested in this paper. I think one thing that really helps, this was not a collaborative paper, but in general, if I do collaborative projects with more technical people, I think having both quantitative and qualitative approach in the paper is very useful because now the models are becoming so good that the qualitative part is more and more important. This is a preprint so far. The paper's coming out next year. It's really about how literary studies have fostered a lot of tools that we can use for the critical AI challenges. And this is now becoming, I guess, a big topic. Like, how do we even tackle this problem of cultural AI? What even is that? Then another project where we tried to show that interpretability, that's usually so technical, actually has a deep humanistic side. So at first we put a visualization of a latent space of a GAN model, not an LLM, generative adversarial network that's trained on speech. We put this on the Biennale, and then we wrote a paper about it where we compare how GANs acquire speech with how brains acquire speech. And we also use Joyce's Finnegan's Wake as a sort of representation of latent space narration because Joyce wrote in language that's not really externalized. It's sort of, you know, a couple of layers under the language that he uses. It's not quite intelligible. You can sort of understand where the narration is going. It's just tight enough for you to be able to go from Joyce's narration into an understanding of what he's doing there. And let's see if this video works. We trained a GAN model on Finnegan's Wake from scratch, where basically the model pushed the novel even more into this anthropic stage. It's much harder to understand.
North America by Port remember constant leafing to anything. North America by Port remember constant leafing to anything.
You see, it's hard to understand. We also put the transcriptor there. If you want to take a look, you can go to the article, and both models are there. One just creates words from scratch. It was trained on just 8 English words. The other one was trained on Finnegan's Wake. And it will create an entirely new sentence for you. And you can kind of see it. You can follow it, how it goes from complete noise, which is what GANs do, into more and more intelligibility. And one reason why we really wanted to write this is because there's so much talk about LLMs, and language in LLMs is so polished, right? It's this glib, orderly output. Whereas language has so many other registers, and in GANs, it's much more noisy, and it's continuous, right? There's no tokenization happening in GANs because speech is continuous. And GANs are continuous throughout. So we really wanted to bring that to the discussion about AI. And this is the volume that I told you about that's coming out in the fall. It's a lot of creative writers, a screenwriter, novelists, digital poets, essayists that reflect on what is really the future of writing, what is happening in this space when AI enters it. I'm really excited about this one. It's 15 essays, and they're very different. Some of them are sort of experimental with AI, others are more philosophical, thinking about the repercussions and how humans can still, you know, come out of this as the writers. I think it's a very optimistic volume in general. Now, just to really wrap up, I just want to show you a couple of things we're doing in the Artificial Humanities Lab. We have a couple of funded projects. 2 are in collaboration with, one is with the University of Bergen on AI and narration, and the other one is with our Paris colleagues on latent spaces of culture. We're doing a lot of smaller projects under these collaborations, like the glossary of AI terms, and a lot of papers coming out of this, and workshops. And then I'm also a part of Text, which is Center for the Contemporary Cultures of Text, hosted at Aarhus University. Got a big grant to basically just study LLMs from this literary and technical perspective. Then I also have a couple of industry collaborations, and it's been wonderful to work with startups because you can actually take a look at the data and see how the users are using it. And these 2 startups are both sort of unique in their approach to AI. It's not AI focused at all. So one focuses on how screenwriters, how their decisions, how the writer's decisions can be helped with AI. It's not about AI really generating all this text for the writer and you need to comb through. It's more about thinking, you know, decision trees and other potential application that AI models can have. And with fan fiction, you know, group writing has been such an overlooked part of writing with AI, because if you just think about screenwriters themselves, right, they tend to write in groups. the writer's room, and so on. And so what happens when one of the co-writers is an AI that's sort of used for feedback? I think that was a big takeaway. When I launched my book, I had Ted Chiang, who's famously against AI there, and I had James Yu, who's the CEO of Pseudowrite and a writer himself. So obviously pro-AI, like offering a big platform for creative writers to use it. And I asked them, what do you think about this idea of a writer chained to a desk, right? Observing the world and digesting that into the words on the page. And they said, well, it's never been true, this solitary part. Writers have always sought out other writers. We always seek feedback. We always, want some kind of exchange about our text before we put it out. So I think this part of creativity is very under-talked right now. We should look into that more. And also, I'm happy to announce that I'm starting the Artificial Humanities series at the University of Exeter Press. I'd be happy to share more about it. We'll be taking books that kind of sort of fit into this idea. I also sit on Briefs on AI and Education board, and I'm co-editing a special issue on world literature and AI with the Journal of World Literature. We just posted a call for papers. And, when I said collaborative, that's what I really mean. I mean, I would just looked at my papers, and about 19% of them are in collaboration, are written, with someone who's sort of outside of my field in some way. One of them is a book that's coming into materialization. It was really a finding by David Avidan, who was a Hebrew poet, who in 1965 wrote to Weizenbaum to get access to Eliza. He caught the wind at MIT. They're making chatbots, and he only got access in 1974 through IBM, and then wrote the first book with Eliza, the first book as a conversation with the chatbot, and it has never been published in other than Hebrew. So we're now publishing it in original English language. My collaborator found it in the archive, and we're making sure that this part of history that's really missing from electronic literature and but experimentation with computing and literature is finally out. And I have another sort of unusual collaboration with the Nerd System Science Lab here, where we think about AI sort of from this planetary perspective, looking at it from the perspective of information processing and transfer and storage. Now, this is all, the scales are humongous, but if I just give you one example of information storage, there's this paper that shows that, well, in green, you can see prokaryotic DNA and pretty much how it hit the ceiling, right? About how much our planet can really handle. Then you got humans in purple. And then at the end, you can see analog storage, which is already going down, and digital storage going up. Digital storage in the next 150 years will likely will overcome the human DNA, which is just a humongous amount of storage that we're completely not prepared to host. And so this is one of the big challenges, besides how energy hungry AI is how you're gonna store all this digital data. And this is why I hope it makes a bit more sense about why Artificial Humanities as a research program obviously focus on this interaction of humans with machines, but they have this planetary approach as well. And just as a last thing, because I've heard most of you are linguists, the book also has this section. When I look at the concept of language throughout history, I think this is really helpful to do for anyone working across timescales, because the concept of, say, information did not mean the same thing 100 years ago than it does now. And it was the same with the concept of language. Now it's being more challenged because a lot of us call what machines produce and generate language as well. So language is in a space of philosophical tension, and also a lot of tension here over in Silicon Valley, just as an interface for all of these models. I'd be happy to talk more about it, but let's conclude now. I think I'm right at 51 minutes, so pretty long. Thank you all for listening.